Mark, yes, sir. So let's go to Mark. We are joined with the man, the legend, best in the business, Mark Sleboda. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay?
Jamarl, I'm alive. How the hell are you? Thanks for having
I'm doing
me.
all right.
Always an honor and pleasure to be on the show.
Always an honor and pleasure to have you, man. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can check Mark on his YouTube channel, Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. You can also check him out on Boosty, Boosty, under the same name, Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. Or if you put in Mark Sleboda, he will appear. He has damn good videos on both. So yeah, Mark, always appreciate having you, man. Mark, I guess there are a few stories. Let's start with Lavrov. And we can move on to the power plants and everything else. Lavrov wasn't at, I guess it was a couple of meetings that Putin was at. And of course, there was a lot of
one meeting
conversation. Oh, okay.
One meeting.
Okay, one meeting. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the talk in the West was that Putin was angry at Lavrov. There was that. The talk was that the Russians were concerned about a decapitation strike, in which case they kept Lavrov out of the meeting. There was that. What was the reality for this? I mean, Lavrov just gave an interview that kind of pushed all that to the side. I don't even know why those things were brought up as part of the discussion. But what was going on with that? Was there any conversation about why he wasn't at the meeting?
Yeah, there has not been any. Lavrov was not asked by the journalist during an extensive interview he has given since then. He spoke at length, but he was not asked and did not speak about that. However, there is enough chatter in the Russian media and the Russian Telegram space that I think it's pretty easy to fit together what has happened. And it's not because of some type of political marriage spat between Putin and Lavrov. I know those are the kind of things that the West hopes for and feels free to thus then speculate on, as they've done repeatedly over, time immemorial, really. They don't have an idea what's really happening, But let's be honest that Kremlinology has never been a scientific skill for the Western mainstream media analysis, and it is more of hokum, tea reading and prognostication and of that kind of sort that has very little to do with reality. There was any indication beforehand. So the meeting in question was a meeting of the Russian National Security Council. And the Russian National Security Council is pretty much the premier decision-making political body in Russia. Absolutely on foreign and military policy, and increasingly on domestic policy, right? All of the politically, institutionally most powerful people in Russia are on the select list of that Security Council. Now, it doesn't always meet with the same members because depending on the topic suggested, some members may not be needed, right? And on others, they're more expansive. And the meeting in question, I think it's fair to say, this is a modern Russian reincarnation of the Politburo. That's what it is. I mean, it's not a stretch to claim that. They meet in the same room where the Politburo used to meet, right? If that's not signal setting. And again, it's not. The West likes to imagine, particularly the Western media, likes to imagine that Putin is some kind of dictator and makes absolute decisions that are then carried out, and it's not true. Putin is certainly, due to his position and due to his abilities, first among equals, right, of Russia's decision makers within their political system. But his most valuable political skill that has kept him in power this long is that he effectively manages Russia's political decision makers. He adjudicates between them. He reaches an equanimity between them. And that is, the function that he serves.
Right.
And this was a very expansive meeting of the Russian National Security Council. We got to see some members of the Security Council that we haven't seen in a long time, like Sergei Ivanov, who was once Putin's top security advisor, equivalent to you could say a U.S. national security advisor. And Sergei Ivanov was once, I think, definitely on the short list to replace Putin. He also a former Russian intelligence, also out of the FSB. They were very, I think, like-minded individuals. But Sergei Ivanov, I think, legitimately had, shall we say, what is often referred to in the Western media as he retired for family issues, right? Something of that sort. But that's actually literally the case, as he had his sons die in an accident, and he, I think, legitimately wanted, to retire actively, but he still maintained his position on the National Security Council, evidently. I did not know that. I think many others didn't. He's still obviously a powerful figure, and he was there for this, right? So, again, very expansive. And practically everyone else was there except noticeably Sergei Lavrov. And the question arises, why was he not there? And it wasn't because of some, political marriage spat between Putin and Lavrov, as has, I think, been pretty conclusively cleared up due to Lavrov's extensive interview on TV since then, right? Where he talked at length about, foreign policy and other things, and obviously has no degradation of his position as foreign minister. And only signaled, unanimity within the Kremlin on these issues, whatever the West might wish to hope otherwise. But the conjecture within Russia is that he was there, he was not there, as the equivalent of what happens during the U.S. State of the Union address, when one particular government official, selected by rotation, is not invited, is left out of the meeting, so that if there was an attack on the room where they were meeting, that there was a chain of succession, right? For someone within the government to pick up the pieces and respond.
Right.
So Russia's official presidential chain of succession is not as lengthy or as elaborate as the American one. Officially, if something happens to the president, it is the chairman of the Duma who accedes to that position. He becomes the acting president until elections are held. Right. So in that case, the prime minister, the head of the speaker of the Russian Federation Council. So it would be Mishustin, the Russian prime minister, who would become the president. This very quiet, very professional, very skillful technocrat, because that's what Mishustin is. But unofficially, I believe that there is another chain of succession in the case of some type of decapitation strike against the Russian leadership, which we know Trump loves decapitation strikes through his terms of.
So the Russians were concerned about that. I mean, so that is real.
Yeah, that seems like it's a real thing now, right? We know that the Kiev regime acting as a proxy for the West, has attempted to assassinate Putin multiple times because they told us so. I mean, they didn't even sugarcoat it. They didn't even lie to it. The Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, right, the sociopathic Kyrylo, I like the dark Budanov, openly admitted we've tried to kill him multiple times. We just haven't succeeded yet, right? So I think it is reflective, right, and a direct symptom of how high the geopolitical tensions are right now between the US and Russia, between the West and Russia, that has to be taken into account by the Russian leadership in such a significant way, because this was a meeting that was bringing together so many of the important decision makers of Russia who were talking, among other things, about the necessity of responding in kind if the U.S., as Trump seemed to indicate, would resume nuclear testing, right? I mean, not testing launch vehicles like Russia has done with the Burevestnik and the Poseidon and the, a test of their strategic forces, and the U.S. just actually tested their own Minutemen, ICBMs, and so forth. This meaning Trump seemed to indicate, and he wasn't clear, exactly if he meant what everyone believed he meant on this, was to start detonating nuclear weapons again. And to be clear, neither the U.S. nor Russia has tested a nuclear weapon, that is, detonated a nuclear warhead, since the early 1990s, right? Yeah. So for decades, right? Everything is done with mathematical subcritical models. China hasn't since 96, I believe. The only one who has is one test by North Korea. But Trump made this weird statement where, because Russia and China had done nuclear testing, he said the U.S. would have had no option, but he was ordering the resumption of nuclear testing. And this caused a great deal of concern in the Kremlin and in China and elsewhere around the world, because this would, really fire off the gun, at least in terms of officiating what has really already become a new nuclear arms race, a much more dangerous nuclear arms race than the first one, I would say. First of all, because we have already been in a qualitative nuclear arms race since the early 2000s, since the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, because they wanted to put missile defense, right, ringing Russia and China and other countries. And why? So that they could nullify Russia's and China's strategic deterrent, right? Why? Because the idea then would, of course, allow them to make a nuclear first strike, with the belief that between that strike and then their own defense, that they could survive whatever was to follow. All right. Obviously, Russia and China are not comfortable with not having a strategic deterrent against the U.S. using their own nuclear weapons on them. So Putin made this clear in multiple speeches, including at Munich in 2007, that at the Munich Security Conference, that if the West goes down this path, then and it starts erecting missile defense in Europe, whatever they said, the nonsense they said at the time about Iran or whatever, Russia never paid any attention to, rightly so, as has been admitted since then. But that Russia would have to then develop missile technology that would not be subject to Western missile defense. Now, Western missile defense never really accomplished, or certainly up to this day, has not accomplished anywhere near the ability, the success rate that, is the potential, right? The threat of missile defense. It just hasn't worked out. The Americans aren't that good at it, right? The Patriot system, not all that it's rocked up to be. The THAAD system as well. There's only a handful of existing systems, and again, the interceptor production is a big problem. But Russia, had no way of knowing that, or nor should it be counted into their decisions, and went about developing a number of missile, delivery system technologies such that they would not be subject to any existing or future U.S. missile defense shield. And the results of that were Russia's hypersonic weapons, right? The Kinjal, the Zircon, the Oreshnik, right? But also Russia's new, more exotic nuclear-powered delivery systems, the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, and the Poseidon nuclear-powered UUV, unmanned underwater vehicle, right? That was the direct result, and that has come out. And that has brought us to this moment that a lot of people don't realize where we're at, of geopolitical tension, right? Because the U.S. has no answer to these weapons. They're calling Russia's development of these weapons, and they're at a very public announcement now, as destabilizing to the existing nuclear, system, right? The presumed position of parity. That's not how Russia sees it at all. They see that system was already destabilized by the U.S. pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty and getting rid of the entirety of the rest of the Western arms control architecture, right?
Yeah.
With the last piece of it, the New START treaty, to expire in February of next year, and giving no indication that it intends to renew it. And the New START treaty is it's the last piece of the Cold War security architecture that the U.S. hasn't pulled out of. Russia has actually suspended at least the inspection part of its mechanism already, because the U.S. was obviously using it to help the Kiev regime target Russia's nuclear triad. But if the New START treaty goes away, we're not only in a qualitative arms race, we're then have the potential to restart a quantitative, because that is the treaty that limits the amount of nuclear warheads and launch vehicles, ICBMs, bombers, on both sides, and has for decades now. The U.S. no longer feels it should be bound by any bilateral treaties with Russia because China, right? And then Russia's like, well, we've never felt, uncomfortable because the United Kingdom and France are not a part of these treaties, and they're on your side. What does this have to do with anything? But anyway, that's the position. So all of these factors going together at the same time, right? First of all, the whole big context is the conflict in Ukraine, right? But then specifically, there are all of these literal nuclear war tensions arising. Russia's, coming to actual deployment of all these weapon systems that were meant to compensate for the U.S. Putting up missile defense in Europe against Russia, pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty and putting them up. Then the U.S. dissolving all the rest of the Cold War security architecture, and now not renewing the New START treaty, and the U.S. announcing the resumption of nuclear testing. This, from the Russian point of view, sounds like a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, right? Or potentially much more so. Because of the whole context of the conflict in Ukraine, where literally the U.S. has been firing missiles under the thin pretext of a Kiev proxy into Russia. So it's a very dangerous situation as far as the Russians go. And I think there is enough indication if the pronouncements of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, that there is all kinds of either intended or attempted dirty trick, false flag operations going on, that the West is cooking up all the time, and Russian intelligence is uncovering and making public and hopefully averting them one by one. The most recent, last week, the SVR announced of a Western and Kiev regime plan or potential plan to, it's actually a familiar one, at least to me, to cause some type of nuclear accident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that would theoretically, cause the largest nuclear power plant in Europe to go critical, and then create a nuclear catastrophe. And again, the idea is the West is losing a proxy conflict that has the potential of altering, the world order,
Yes.
of being seen as a complete defeat of the U.S.-led Western global hegemony and having all kinds of geopolitical repercussions because of that, and they cannot allow that. So they've got to get out of that box. And this type of shock situation, right, along the lines of Naomi Klein's very good, whatever else she's done, Shock Doctrine, the book, that would create a situation where the rules of the game would change, and potentially the idea is force Russia to freeze the conflict, right, at least along the current lines. Now Russia hopes that doesn't happen. And there's also the question, they had the big question, well, how do we successfully pin it on Russia then? Right? That was the big problem they were having. And it has to be said that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has long been in, with all of its reactors, in cold shutdown, which
Poses
how would they then create that situation, right? I mean, it still requires cooling water, yes, but even then, it wouldn't lead to a Chernobyl type situation,
Right.
right? It would be difficult to imagine how they would go about creating that. But anyway, there's constantly warnings by Russian intelligence of this type of asymmetric warfare, unconventional warfare, hybrid warfare, whatever you want to call it, plots that are being cooked up by the West, and the SVR is, sussing them out, as is their job, and calling them out, and hopefully that is then preventing them from being enacted. We could hope, but again, that is all the context of this heightened sense of geopolitical tension right now, where Russia feels compelled to leave a minister out of an important national security council meeting because they feel that they could be targeted by Kiev and thus the West, because the Kiev regime doesn't do anything that's not, as a puppet for the U.S. and the West in this, whatever pretext of playing some type of mediator, between the two warring sides that Russia has allowed Trump to assume the fiction of right now, but doesn't actually take seriously.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Lavrov pointed out something that seemed to be apparent to me at the Alaska summit. When Putin and Trump came out, they acted as if there was a deal on the table. Lavrov seems to indicate that there was a deal on the table, that Putin...
No, I think that is too strong a word. I know some people in the alt media are using that. The word that Lavrov has used is an understanding. That is not a deal. That is, we talked about something, right? We threw it around. It's a potential. That is not a deal, right? i.e., something that is written down and waiting to be signed, right?
Okay.
So what Russia has suggested is that the U.S. made a proposal, an informal, shall we say, ballpark figure proposal for a it not really a settlement of the conflict, but a freezing of the conflict with pending other diplomatic activity to come to a permanent settlement of the conflict that Russia felt they could suggest. And that supposedly, according to some things that have come out of the Western media, and that at the very least what Lavrov and others have intimated at, does not preclude that Russia may have agreed to a freezing of the conflict in the south, in the Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and presumably Dnipropetrovsk as well, if the Kiev regime completely withdrew all of its military forces from the remainder that they still hold in the Donbass, right? That is the presumption of the understanding that was at least the first step, right, in a process. But there was no deal. There was nothing signed. Supposedly, the story goes, is that this is what what convinced Putin to come to Alaska when he had always been against, had been keeping Trump, who was desperate for a face-on-face meeting because he has this belief that, he's such a whatever, such a mensch that he can, talk anyone into anything, blah, 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 through sheer force of his charisma, if he can just sit down with them face to face. And Russia views this whole thing as, the highest of geopolitical level talks at the highest level that need to be codified down in absolute, documented, signed detail, as in the Cold War architecture that was established between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the first Cold War. So they have completely where Trump thinks everything can be done with a suggestion, a handshake, and around the Gulf or something like that, to seal the deal. But the idea that was supposedly what brought Putin to Alaska, right? And that Russia supposedly said, all right, that's an interesting proposal. If that's the direction that we're moving, we can talk, right? We can talk. But I don't think things actually went well in Alaska at all. And those people who have suggested that it did, and that Russia left with a feeling that everything was settled and there was a deal on the table, I think are reading things that they want to see into it and exaggerating the sense. They're completely ignoring the fact that the summit was called off an entire day early. In fact, they left without even having luncheon. And they had no joint statements to the press as had previously. I mean, questions from the press. They did both make a statement, and it was clear to me in that statement that Trump was very much not happy. He was very much not energetic. He was very not much the Trump who had just gotten closer to signing or ending the conflict in Ukraine, about which he has made such a personal thing about. The idea that things went well at Alaska because of some potential deal just does not square with these facts of the way that the meeting ended or of what has happened since then. So I don't believe it, right? I don't know that it was necessarily a row, but I think the whole meeting was at complete, still at cross purposes. And whatever Trump may have suggested, it's been referred to as the Witkoff plan without any firm indication, simply because Witkoff maybe delivered it to Putin. Right. But as far as the discussions about it, if that's what happened at Alaska goes, I don't think they actually went very well. And since then, everything, but it must be said that Russia and Lavrov and Putin and others have made continual veiled reference
To
to
Alaska.
this understanding that we reached at Alaska.
Right.
And obviously, whatever that understanding was that the Russians did walk away from that meeting has been completely ignored from the United States from as soon as that meeting ended. And the Russians feel peeved about it, right? I think they're actually whining about it, to be perfectly honest.
Wait, so what's the word again? You say you think they're actually what about it?
Peeved, that they're
Well, you
unhappy
said peeved,
about it.
but
Yeah,
there was
peeved.
another word to use. Winding?
Whining. They're
Oh,
whining.
whining. Oh, whining
Yeah,
about it.
like-
Well,
like-
Lavrov keeps bringing
we
it up.
had a deal. We had an understanding, and you're walking back on it. I mean, which to
Yeah.
me is just like, if you ever think you had an understanding with Trump and the United States that would end this conflict, right, on anything less than complete American terms, right, American dictated terms preferential to the U.S. and the Kiev regime, then you were naive. And I think they are.
You really? Okay.
I
mean,
think
Lavrov keeps bringing it up. He brings it
I
up all the
keep
time.
bringing it up, and I'm like, obviously the U.S. isn't interested in whatever understanding that you think that you had, and probably never was. So get back to the war.
Well, that's the other part.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, why keep publicly whining about it? What is that going to do? And the fact that they do, to me, is kind of desperate. Like, oh, we were so hoping, and to me, it was never a possibility. And if they thought that it was, well, then they were wrong.
Okay, well, this is confusing to me because two things seem to be happening at once.
Yes.
Lavrov continues to bring up, I don't take the Russians as being naive. At the very least, if they're still naive.
They were certainly in Minsk.
Well, right. But that's
2014 and 2015. And for the 8 years that led up to that. And Putin has admitted that that was a mistake. So
agreed.
Don't suggest that the Kremlin can't be naive, because Putin has a natural desire to resolve things with as little conflict as possible. It is
Let me explain what I mean.
Base position.
I just mean after Minsk, after the Istanbul agreements, after seeing Donald Trump lie to Iran, after seeing Donald Trump lie in Gaza, after you've looked at the person who you're effectively dealing with. It would be shocking to me if you're naive about the character of this person.
I'm going to say once again, right? I know Frank Herbert in the Dune book said that fear is the mind killer.
Yes.
But I'm going to stand by my reversion of that hope is the mind killer.
Oh, so you think they're just hoping for a deal? See, from my point of view, they're chasing safety. And if Putin thinks
there is that, but sometimes you're just not going to get safety.
Yeah, that's fair.
That caution is not going, and an overabundance of caution is not going to do you well. And I think
it'll be greatly disappointing if they're that naive. And I'm just saying it'll be disappointing. I mean, Lavrov, I agree with you. Lavrov is continually talking.
You've grown up in the same era I have, right? You remember all those Charlie Brown cartoons.
The football.
Lucy is sitting out there with the football, right?
Yeah.
And every time Charlie Brown says, "No, I'm not going to play that game again," right? I know what you're going to do. And she says, No, for real this time. And then he always gets suckered into it. And runs up, and at the last minute, she pulls the ball away again, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Fair enough. Like you said, hope springs eternal.
Yeah, like a plague it does. Like a plague it does.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, okay, good. I'm glad you cleared that up, because that was confusing to me. Because to me, it sounded like two things were happening.
That's my take. Other people I know have other takes, and that, I believe, is premised on their argument from Alaska, that everything at Alaska was great and there was some kind of deal and the conflict was about to end. And I never got that reading out of Alaska at all.
Yeah.
So,